Italy, 1944. Not every front announced itself with noise. This sector lay away from the headlines of the campaign. No sweeping offensives passed through it. No armored thrusts raced across its roads. Instead, it stretched across broken terrain, mountain ridges, narrow valleys, scattered villages that had already learned to live with uncertainty. On the map, it appeared stable. On the ground, it felt simply unfinished. For Allied command, the area presented a familiar problem of war management. Forces were limited, demands were endless. Every mile of front could not be treated as critical at the same time. Some sectors burned constantly, others cooled, at least for a while. This one had cooled. Reports arriving at headquarters were consistent in their tone. No major enemy movements, no artillery preparation, no signs of a large-scale buildup. Patrols returned without contact. Aerial observation showed little that justified concern. Compared to the violence elsewhere, the silence here was striking. So the sector was categorized. Inactive. The word carried weight. It implied more than quiet. It suggested predictability. An inactive sector was not expected to surprise. It did not demand urgent reinforcement. It could be managed, monitored, and, if necessary, temporarily deprioritized. On the command map, the line looked clean. On the ground, it felt thin. Infantry units held long stretches of difficult terrain. Positions were defensible, but only if fully manned and constantly watched. Roads twisted through valleys that offered cover to anyone who knew how to use them. Visibility was often limited, especially at night or in bad weather. Yet nothing dramatic happened. Days passed without incident, then weeks. The lack of enemy action slowly reshaped behavior. Patrols still went out, but the sense of expectation faded. Watches were maintained, but urgency softened. Men learned the rhythms of a front that seemed to exist outside the main war. The quiet began to feel permanent. This perception fed back into command decisions. Resources were shifted where fighting was louder and more visible. Heavy weapons were reassigned. Reserves were pulled back. The sector remained occupied, but its margin for error narrowed. No one announced that the line was weak. No one needed to. The classification itself carried the message. Inactive sectors did not demand constant attention. They were assumed to hold unless proven otherwise. Stability was taken as evidence of safety. That assumption rested on a fragile foundation. Silence in war can mean exhaustion. It can mean preparation. Or it can mean something is moving carefully, deliberately, and out of sight. At this stage, none of that was visible. There were no clear warnings, no dramatic failures, no reason from a distance to challenge the label that had been applied. The front appeared quiet. And because it appeared quiet, it was treated as such. What command did not yet understand was that the sector was not inactive. It was only unobserved in the ways that mattered most. From headquarters, the sector appeared to justify its label. Command decisions in Italy were driven by pressure elsewhere. Major offensives demanded constant reinforcement. Artillery ammunition, air support, engineers, and fresh infantry were always in short supply. Every request approved in one place meant a denial somewhere else. In that environment, prioritization was not optional, it was survival. This sector did not compete well for attention. Intelligence summaries showed no concentration of enemy forces opposite the line. Reconnaissance flights reported scattered movement at most, nothing that suggested preparation for a large attack. Intercepted communications lacked urgency. Compared to the activity along more contested fronts, the data here looked flat. Equally important was the pattern of recent history. There had been no assaults, no sustained probing attacks, no artillery registration that signaled an upcoming push. Patrol reports returned with the same phrasing, day after day, nothing significant to report. The repetition itself became evidence. Silence hardened into expectation. Commanders did not assume the enemy was gone. They assumed the enemy was constrained, short of manpower, unwilling to risk exposure, focused elsewhere. In Italy's broken terrain, such assumptions had often been correct. Many quiet sectors remained quiet for months at a time. The war rewarded attention to trends, not anomalies. From a planning perspective, the sector offered stability. It anchored a portion of the line without consuming disproportionate resources. Units that were experienced enough to hold ground. Defensive positions existed. Supply routes functioned. There was no immediate reason to intervene. So command acted rationally, based on what it believed it knew. Resources were reallocated incrementally, not dramatically. A battalion reassigned here. Heavy weapons shifted there. Reserve elements moved closer to areas where contact was frequent and visible. The sector remained occupied, but its redundancy was reduced. This was not neglect. It was confidence. Confidence that the enemy would behave in familiar ways. Confidence that danger would announce itself before becoming decisive. Confidence that the front, as currently held, was sufficient. Maps reinforced that belief. On operational charts, the line looked continuous. Boundaries were clear. Units were accounted for. There were no obvious gaps, only spaces judged unlikely to be exploited. The abstraction of the map smoothed out the irregularities of terrain and manpower. What could not be mapped easily was intent. The enemy's lack of visible aggression was interpreted as limitation rather than design. The possibility that silence itself was a method did not fit established frameworks. Command doctrine assumed that attacks required preparation that could be detected. Movement implied exposure. Exposure produced warning. This logic had worked before. What it did not account for was an approach that avoided exposure entirely. As days passed without incident, the classification reinforced itself. Each quiet report confirmed the previous one. The sector became background, important enough to hold, but not important enough to question. By the time doubts might have formed, there was nothing concrete to support them. The sector was quiet. The data was quiet. The paperwork was quiet. And in war, quiet often feels like safety, right up until it is. On the ground, the label carried consequences that no map could show. An inactive sector did not mean empty. Men still held the line, weapons were still manned, orders were still followed, but the margin for error, the quiet redundancy that keeps a front stable, began to disappear. Positions that once had depth were reduced to outlines. Where companies had covered terrain with overlapping fields of observation, platoons now stretched themselves thinner. Gaps did not appear suddenly, they grew. Each adjustment seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they changed the character of the line. Patrol patterns shifted first. With fewer men available, patrols became less frequent and more predictable. Routes were reused. Timings settled into habits. Night movements were shortened to reduce fatigue. The goal was no longer to dominate the space between positions, but simply to confirm that nothing obvious was happening. Observation followed the same pattern. Sentries watched assigned sectors, but coverage narrowed. Valleys and ravines that were difficult to monitor received less attention. In broken terrain, this mattered. Lines of sight were short. Darkness arrived early. A position could feel secure while being bypassed entirely. Fatigue accumulated quietly. Longer watches, fewer reliefs, and the monotony of a front that never seemed to change dulled urgency. Men remained disciplined, but alertness softened. The difference was subtle, noticed more in hindsight than in the moment. No one declared the sector weak. It did not feel weak, it felt routine. Communication reflected that routine. Reports focused on maintenance, weather, supply, and minor adjustments. When something went wrong, a delayed patrol, a damaged line, a missing item, it was framed as an isolated issue, not a symptom. The label shaped interpretation. In an active sector, small anomalies demand attention because they may signal something larger. In an inactive one, the same anomalies are absorbed into normal friction. The assumption of safety filters how information is read. Coordination between units also changed. With reduced manpower, boundaries became administrative rather than physical. Neighboring units knew where lines were drawn, but contact was limited. Shared patrols became rare. The spaces between units existed more on paper than in practice. At night, those spaces expanded. None of this violated orders. None of it felt reckless. All of it made sense under the assumption that the enemy was not attempting anything bold. What the men on the line could not see was how their world now appeared from the other side. To an enemy moving cautiously, the sector no longer looked solid. It looked patterned, predictable, thin in places that were difficult to observe. The front was still there, but it had stopped watching itself continuously. Inactive had become more than a label. It had become a way of operating. And that way of operating assumed one critical thing, that any serious threat would reveal itself before it mattered. The men holding the line did their jobs as they understood them. They maintained positions, they followed schedules, they reported what they saw. What they did not see, what they could not see, was how much the definition of safety had narrowed around them. The line still existed, but it was no longer resilient. The enemy did not prepare a breakthrough. There was no artillery registration to announce intent, no concentration of armor to betray mass, no sudden surge in radio traffic that might signal an attack. What unfolded instead was quieter and far more difficult to detect. Small units moved. They did not advance along roads or obvious approaches. They avoided villages. They avoided contact. Movement favored ravines, tree lines, and the broken folds of the terrain that maps flattened but soldiers knew intimately. Progress was measured not in miles, but in opportunities. This was not an attempt to seize ground quickly. It was an attempt to pass through unnoticed. Infiltration relies on patience. Units moved at night, halted before dawn and waited. They listened, they observed. When a sentry shifted position, they marked it. When a patrol passed on a predictable route, they learned the timing. Nothing was rushed. Speed was less important than invisibility. The method exploited assumptions rather than defenses. An assault expects resistance. Infiltration expects indifference. Where defenses were strong and alert, movement stopped. Where coverage thinned, where no one expected pressure, movement resumed. The enemy did not test the line everywhere. It tested it where it was least likely to be watching. Terrain amplified the effect. Italy's mountains fractured visibility. Valleys bent sound. A position could dominate a ridgeline and still leave blind ground below. Paths invisible by day became usable corridors at night. A line that looked continuous from above contained countless seams at ground level. Infiltrators used those seams. They passed between positions rather than against them. They slipped behind observation posts without engaging them. The objective was not to defeat defenders head-on, but to render their presence irrelevant by operating beyond them. This approach created a strange asymmetry. Frontline troops continued their routines, unaware that the fight was happening elsewhere. The enemy did not appear where expected. Instead, effects appeared behind the line, cut wires, missing supplies, disrupted movement without a visible source. The method avoided escalation. There was no dramatic moment that demanded immediate response. Each action was small, reversible, and easy to misinterpret. A broken line could be blamed on weather. A missed patrol could be delayed. A brief contact could be dismissed as an isolated incident. Infiltration thrives on that ambiguity. It allows pressure to build without triggering alarms. It creates consequences before explanations. By the time defenders sense a pattern, the pattern has already done its work. The enemy's success did not depend on overwhelming force. It depended on being ignored. As long as the sector remained classified as inactive, the infiltration faced fewer obstacles. Fewer patrols meant fewer chances of discovery. Predictable routines meant easier avoidance. Reduced coordination meant that local warnings stayed local. The front had not been breached in the traditional sense. It had been quietly entered. And once inside, the rules changed. The battle would not announce itself with noise or mass. It would reveal itself through absence, missing men, broken connections, and reports that no longer matched the map. By the time that became clear, the infiltration had already passed its most dangerous phase. It was no longer trying to get in. It was already there. The earliest signs did not look like danger. They appeared as inconveniences, small disruptions that fit comfortably within the normal friction of war. A patrol returned late. A field telephone line went dead overnight. A sentry position failed to report at the expected time. None of these events, on their own, demanded escalation. Each had an explanation. Terrain delayed movement, weather interfered with communications, equipment failed, men made mistakes. In a sector already labeled inactive, these explanations felt sufficient. They closed questions rather than opened them. Reports were written carefully and briefly. Patrol delayed, returned safely. Line down, cause unknown. Post temporarily unmanned, corrected. Nothing in the language suggested urgency. There was no reason it should have. The enemy understood this rhythm. Infiltration does not begin by drawing attention. It begins by creating effects that resemble coincidence. Small actions were taken where they could be dismissed, wires cut where storms were common, movement where patrols were infrequent, brief contacts where no follow-up was expected. These actions did not aim to win fights. They aimed to shape interpretation. As days passed, the signs accumulated without connecting. One unit noticed missing supplies, another reported unfamiliar footprints, a third mentioned hearing movement at night that could not be located. Each observation stayed within its own boundary, addressed locally and forgotten quickly. No single report crossed the threshold of alarm. Coordination was the missing element. Because the sector was quiet, there was no mechanism forcing disparate observations into a shared picture. Warnings did not flow upward with urgency. Command did not demand synthesis. The system assumed that serious threats would be obvious and unmistakable. This one was not. The enemy exploited that assumption carefully. They did not linger where they might be seen twice. They did not repeat actions in the same place. Every movement was designed to remain ambiguous, noticeable, but never decisive. As a result, the line absorbed these disturbances without reacting. The front still looked intact on the map. Units still occupied their positions. Patrols still went out. The structure remained visible even as its connections weakened. What made this stage so dangerous was its plausibility. Nothing felt wrong enough to justify drastic action. Raising alarms carried risk. False warnings eroded credibility and drew unwanted scrutiny. In an inactive sector, caution cut both ways. It discouraged overreaction as much as it discouraged complacency. Men on the line sensed unease, but lacked language for it. Something was happening, but it did not look like an attack. It did not behave like one. There was no clear enemy presence to point to, no engagement to anchor concern. The war, in this place, seemed to operate by different rules. By the time patterns began to form, by the time absences felt less random and disruptions felt more deliberate, the window for easy correction had already closed. The infiltration had passed its quietest phase. The signs were there. They simply did not look like signs yet. The front did not break with gunfire. It loosened. As infiltration deepened, the first thing to disappear was certainty. Units began to lose regular contact with one another. Messages took longer to arrive or failed entirely. Patrols returned with incomplete information, unsure whether gaps they passed through were temporary or permanent. Nothing looked like an attack. Yet the line no longer behaved like a line. Supply movement became unpredictable. Convoys encountered obstacles where none had existed before. Routes that had been safe days earlier suddenly felt exposed. Small delays compounded, forcing improvisation. Improvisation created new patterns, and those patterns were observed. Command posts sensed disorder without a clear cause. Requests came in that did not align. One unit asked for clarification on boundaries that were supposed to be fixed. Another reported activity behind its position without having been engaged from the front. A third could not account for neighboring forces that should have been present. Each issue was manageable on its own. Together, they formed a problem no one could yet name. The absence of open combat made diagnosis difficult. There was no focal point, no place to concentrate attention or resources. The enemy was not applying pressure evenly or visibly. Instead, pressure appeared in logistics, communication, and orientation. The result was fragmentation. Units began to operate based on assumptions rather than coordination. Officers made local decisions to secure flanks that might not exist. Patrols were redirected to investigate rumors rather than maintain coverage. Time was spent confirming what should have been known already. This drained momentum. Every corrective action reduced attention elsewhere. The front did not collapse everywhere at once. It thinned selectively, becoming weaker precisely where effort was diverted. The enemy took advantage of this imbalance. Movement increased where defenders hesitated. Areas that had been merely unobserved became effectively uncontrolled. The line's shape, once defined by positions and orders, began to drift away from reality. Critically, there was still no battle to report. No engagement large enough to justify immediate reinforcement. No single incident dramatic enough to override the sector's classification. The absence of noise delayed recognition even as consequences grew. Men on the ground felt the shift before they could articulate it. The front no longer felt anchored. Positions seemed isolated rather than connected. Night brought uncertainty instead of routine. The sense that someone else was watching, moving where no one expected, became harder to dismiss. By the time this unease reached command channels, it arrived as confusion, not urgency. The line had not been forced open. It had been quietly pulled apart. And once coherence was lost, restoring it required something the sector no longer had in reserve: time. The first casualty reports arrived without context. They did not follow an engagement summary or an urgent request for support. They appeared as fragments, lists of wounded, notes of missing men, short messages requesting medical evacuation. There was no single incident to attach them to, no location that could be circled on a map and labeled as a fight. That absence was alarming. Casualties are expected after contact. They make sense when paired with an action. Here, they arrived alone. A patrol had not returned. A sentry had been found wounded. A supply party had taken fire from an unknown direction and dispersed without seeing the enemy. Each report was small. Individually, none suggested catastrophe. Collectively, they raised a question command was unprepared to answer. How could losses be increasing in a sector where no battle had occurred? Medical units noticed first. Wounded men arrived with stories that did not align. Some described brief, close-range encounters in darkness. Others reported shots fired from behind positions thought to be secure. A few could not describe the contact at all, only that it had happened suddenly and ended just as quickly. Missing personnel were harder to explain. Men vanished during routine movement. Patrols lost members without clear indication of where or how. In terrain that made recovery difficult, absence itself became the evidence. Names appeared on lists without explanations attached. Paperwork began to accumulate. Casualty figures rose incrementally, not dramatically. There was no spike that demanded immediate response. Instead, there was a steady increase that resisted categorization. The losses did not correlate with known enemy actions. They did not follow predictable patterns. This made them easy to misread. Command initially treated the reports as delayed fallout from earlier, unrelated incidents. The assumption was that friction, not enemy action, was responsible. Without a defined engagement, the idea of a serious threat remained abstract. Yet the numbers continued to climb. Each new report made the previous ones harder to dismiss. The accumulation itself became the signal. Something was happening that standard reporting structures could not capture. What unsettled commanders most was the distribution. Losses were spread across units that should not have been under pressure at the same time. They occurred behind the line as often as at it. The front, as drawn, no longer explained where men were being hurt or lost. The realization arrived slowly and uncomfortably. The sector had been compromised without being attacked. The enemy had not needed to break through in force. It had inflicted damage by undermining the assumptions that governed reporting and response. Casualties were no longer tied to battles. They were tied to presence. By the time command recognized that these reports were not isolated, the opportunity to contain the situation quietly had passed. The paperwork had done what the gunfire had not. It made the problem impossible to ignore. Once the casualty reports were acknowledged as a pattern, command attempted to reassert control. The effort began with questions. Where exactly were these losses occurring? Which units were in contact? What enemy forces were responsible? The answers did not align. Maps were updated, then revised again. Reports placed enemy activity in locations that contradicted one another. Units described threats behind their positions, while others reported quiet directly ahead. The front, as represented on charts, no longer matched the front as experienced by the men holding it. This disconnect was more dangerous than the infiltration itself. Command systems rely on shared reference points. When those points dissolve, coordination becomes guesswork. Orders were issued based on assumptions that could not be verified. Some units were told to hold positions that no longer anchored anything. Others were directed to secure routes that had already been compromised. Reinforcements were requested, but cautiously. Without a clearly defined enemy concentration, command hesitated to commit reserves aggressively. Sending large forces into uncertain terrain risked creating new vulnerabilities elsewhere. The sector's earlier classification still exerted influence, slowing decisive action even as evidence mounted. Information arrived faster than it could be processed. Field reports described fleeting contacts and movements that vanished before they could be fixed on a map. Reconnaissance attempts returned inconclusive. Patrols sent to clarify the situation often came back with more uncertainty, not less. Each attempt to clarify the picture seemed to distort it further. Communication breakdown compounded the problem. Units interpreted guidance differently. Some tightened their defenses, others attempted to re-establish contact with neighbors, and still others focused on protecting supply routes. These responses were logical in isolation, but uncoordinated in practice. The result was reactive behavior without a central narrative. Command no longer controlled the tempo. It responded to events after they occurred. By the time an order reached the field, the situation it addressed had often changed. This delay allowed infiltration to continue without decisive interruption. The enemy did not need to outfight Allied forces. It only needed to stay ahead of their understanding. As uncertainty spread upward, confidence eroded downward. Officers on the line sensed hesitation from above. Guidance arrived cautiously worded and conditional. The absence of a clear directive reinforced the feeling that the situation was slipping beyond immediate control. This was the moment when the cost of misclassification became fully visible. Labeling the sector inactive had delayed the development of tools needed to understand it under stress. When activity finally demanded attention, the systems designed to manage crisis were already behind. The front had not collapsed yet, but command no longer knew precisely where it was. And without that knowledge, every decision risked reinforcing the very disorder it was meant to correct. Understanding came only after the damage had spread too far to ignore. Once reinforcements stabilized portions of the line and emergency measures slowed further losses, command shifted from reaction to reconstruction. The immediate question was no longer how to stop the problem, but how it had been allowed to develop unnoticed. This process was slow and uncomfortable. Reports were gathered again, this time not to guide action, but to explain failure. Patrol logs were reread, communication outages were re-examined, casualty reports were reorganized chronologically rather than by unit. What had once appeared random began to reveal structure. The enemy's presence had not been concentrated. It had been distributed. Infiltration routes traced themselves backward through the data, along ravines that had gone unpatrolled, through boundary zones between units, across terrain dismissed as impractical for movement. Each path corresponded to a place where assumptions had replaced verification. What became clear was not a single mistake, but a chain. The initial classification of the sector as inactive had shaped expectations. Those expectations influenced how reports were interpreted. Interpretation determined response speed. Response speed determined opportunity. By the time evidence contradicted the original label, the label itself had delayed acceptance. Command realized that the front had not been breached suddenly. It had been hollowed out. Enemy units had moved behind positions without forcing them. They had disrupted logistics without engaging defenses. They had inflicted casualties without presenting targets. Every action exploited the same vulnerability, the belief that danger announces itself. Doctrine had not prepared for this. Planning frameworks assumed escalation would be visible. Intelligence systems were tuned to detect buildup, not dispersion. Reporting structures emphasized engagement over absence. Infiltration exploited all three. This realization forced an uncomfortable reassessment. The sector had not failed because men lacked discipline. It had not failed because commanders ignored warnings. It had failed because the system misread silence. Silence had been interpreted as stability when it was actually concealment. In hindsight, the signs were present, but only in aggregate. No single report would have justified alarm. Only when viewed together did they reveal intent. The system had not been designed to see patterns formed by small, disconnected events. By the time command fully understood this, the damage was already accounted for in lists of wounded and missing. The lesson was clear but costly. Inactive did not mean safe. Quiet did not mean secure. And the absence of battle did not mean the absence of threat. The front had not been defeated in a clash of arms. It had been defeated in interpretation. When the situation finally stabilized, the sector no longer resembled the place it had been labeled months earlier. The line still existed, but its meaning had changed. Positions were reinforced, patrols were expanded, boundaries were tightened. What had once been treated as background now demanded constant attention. The quiet had been redefined, not as safety, but as uncertainty. The losses could not be undone. Men who had disappeared during routine movements were never fully accounted for. Casualties suffered without a clear battle never fit neatly into operational summaries. Their absence lingered as an unresolved cost of decisions made far from the line itself. For command, the episode forced a fundamental reassessment. The failure had not come from ignoring danger. It had come from defining danger too narrowly. By equating threat with visibility, artillery fire, massed movement, obvious pressure, the system had overlooked methods designed to avoid those signals entirely. This was the deeper lesson of the sector. War does not always announce its turning points. Sometimes it advances quietly through assumptions left unchallenged and routines left unquestioned. In this case, the label inactive had become more than a description. It had shaped perception, interpretation, and response. Once applied, it resisted contradiction. Reports that might have raised alarms elsewhere were absorbed as noise. Delays were tolerated. Absences were explained away. The system did not fail because it lacked information. It failed because it filtered that information through a belief that no longer matched reality. The enemy understood this. Infiltration succeeded not because it was powerful, but because it was compatible with Allied expectations. It exploited gaps not only in terrain, but in attention. It moved where defenders assumed no movement mattered. By the time those assumptions were revised, the damage was already visible on casualty lists rather than maps. This episode did not end the campaign in Italy. It did not decide the war, but it reshaped how quiet sectors were understood thereafter. Silence was no longer treated as reassurance. Stability demanded verification, not assumption. The absence of contact became a question rather than an answer. For the men who held the line afterward, the front felt different. Not louder, not more violent, but watched by both sides. The sector had not collapsed in a dramatic breakthrough. It had dissolved under the weight of misinterpretation. Its story served as a reminder that in war, danger does not always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives labeled as nothing at all. And by the time the casualty reports arrive, the real battle has already been fought and lost, without anyone realizing when it began.